Level 1-2. Nolan. Nolan hadn't slept in days. 3 days to be exact. 3 whole days without a wink of sleep. A new record, he thought to himself grimly as daylight approached. Nolan had been a turnkey down an ogre dungeon for almost 7 years now. And considering that, for the past 7 years, he had just so happened to work inside a place that just so happened to be filled with the kingdom's worst of the worst, half of which wanted nothing more than to rip his fond-to-be-damned elf head off and put it on a stick, some sleepless nights were to be expected. Some sleepless nights, and maybe even the occasional Tuesday, but three whole fond-to-be-damned nights without sleep? This was all new territory for him. This was a whole new animal. And speaking of animals, he could not help but wonder if it had anything to do with Garland Macmillan. Still, he made the most of it, he thought to himself. Never one to wait in bed for a sleep, for a peace that would never, ever come. Nolan had spent the better part of his entire third night awake, sitting inside a chalk circle that he had drawn upon his parlor floor, surrounding it with magical candles that had glowed green throughout the night. And in this circle, he had meditated. He had meditated the entire third night away, as best as he could, considering there was a fox perpetually resting upon his lap that wasn't showing any signs whatsoever of snoozing anywhere else anytime soon. "Get off, Swifty!" Nolan had tried. "Get off!" But it was all in vain. Swifty, that was the fox's name. That was the name given by Nolan to the only creature to have bested him so far. And so Swifty had gone from being that wretched little creature that somehow continued to find its way into Nolan's house and onto his couch, no matter how many times Nolan had boarded up the windows, to Nolan's pet fox. A fox that Nolan had bought food for, cared for, groomed for, and even let sleep anywhere he wanted to, even on the couch. Though obviously tonight, Swifty wasn't interested in any couch now, was he? "Get off!" Nolan tried once more in futility, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. The night was over and the day of days had finally arrived, and Nolan could not help but wonder if there would be any peace for him anymore. He could not help but wonder how many more sleepless nights would he be in store for now that Ogre Dungeon would be receiving custody of one Garland Macmillan today. "Kill me! Macmillan," Nolan said to himself, and as he did, he looked up at his parlor walls. And where there weren't stacks of rag books or wall arts devoted to legendary Linus, there was an embarrassing assortment of clipping after newspaper clipping splattered across his walls, devoted entirely to the exploits of who was once easily considered to be the most brightest, most famous, most benevolent young elf in all of Autumn's history, who, of course, was now also considered to be the most infamous, most vicious, and sadistic, violent little creature in all of Autumn's history as well. Garland Macmillan. Why? Nolan had to ask himself. Why haven't I torn all these down yet? To which he really didn't know the answer to. Nor did he know why he had spent the past few years collecting them and posting them all over his walls in the first place. What was it about Garland Macmillan that had so strangely appealed to him, and for that matter, the entire kingdom too? Were they all just blind? Was Nolan just blind? Was he a fool? Nolan took one last look at the last clipping, the final clipping of his entire Macmillan collection. It of course read, "Half of Rudo burned to the ground, over 375 creatures confirmed dead, and Lord Garland Macmillan suspected of murder." Why, oh why, Nolan had to ask himself. Why did he ever do such a thing? But most importantly of all, why did it feel as if he was the only creature in all of Autumn seeming to want to know the answer to this question? Why did it feel as if nobody else seemed to want to know? Why Lord Garland Macmillan, the once most prominent young lord of their age, went batshit crazy one night? Why did it always feel as if whenever anything went batshit crazy in the kingdom of Autumn, the solution had always been to just simply sweep it under the rug, pretend that it never happened, that the creature in question had never happened either, had never existed, and that everything was still just hunky-dory and elf-like in the kingdom of Autumn? To which, of course, Nolan always knew the answer to be that if things were not handled that way in the kingdom of Autumn, then he would be out of a job, now wouldn't he? Because there would most certainly be no reason for Ogre Dungeon anymore, and there would be most certainly no reason for him either. That's why. Still, in spite of it all, to nobody's surprise greater than himself, as hard as he tried not to, Nolan could not help but feel sorry for Garland Macmillan. And perhaps that was what had frightened him and kept him up most of all. Because Nolan had never, ever felt sorry for a fiend. Not in his entire adult life. Not since the incident anyways. And yet still, if he could somehow feel sorry, pity even, for who was probably in all likelihood the the worst and most infamous fiend of all time, who's to say Nolan would not wake up one day and start feeling sorry for another fiend, and another, and maybe the whole flippin' dungeon one day when weakness was not to be tolerated. Weakness was not to be tolerated. Not an ogre dungeon, not ever. Nobody knew that better than him. After all, he most certainly had the scars to prove it. Nolan pinched the candle lights out between his fingers. He said his final goodbyes to the idea of slumber, and he flipped himself up off the floor into a handstand position, where he proceeded to successfully bust out 50 over 50 upside-down push-ups. Some elves like a good old spot of tea in the morning to wake themselves up. Nolan preferred upside-down push-ups. Nolan finished the last of the push-ups, and he flipped himself up back onto his feet. He floated on over to the kitchenette, and his kitchenette was, as you might expect it to be, filthy. Utterly filthy and disgusting and lacking in a lady's touch, of any kind, of any race, because truth be told, a lady was the last thing to have entered Nolan's place since he first bought it 3.5 years ago. Stacks of dirty dishes were everywhere. There were open cupboards galore. There was a fat wounded flour bag bleeding white powder all over the place, and the permanent smell of rotten chicken wafted everywhere. Unnoticing the smell, he had become all but used to it. Nolan lit the oven fires. He tossed 3 eggs into a dirty skillet to cook, and he cleaned himself off a plate with some cutlery for the morning meal. He then slapped 3 eggs between 2 crusted pieces of lambness life, and he scarfed the whole thing down in less than 4 bites. Next, Nolan descended down into his wash basin cubby, located in the basement, and though he felt far too exhausted, far too corpse-like from his 3-day ordeal with insomnia to wash up proper, he still managed to shave his face. Because though Nolan was often considered to be very unelf-like indeed, he most certainly refused to ever be considered dwarf-like. That was for damn sure. And so the whiskers had to go, and so they did. Every single whisker washed down the basin drain, along with a full face's worth of shaving scum. Nolan washed the remains of the scum off his face, and he gave himself a good look in the mirror. One really good look. He stared at his face up and down in detail, but most importantly of all at the scar that ran across it from his left eyebrow down to his right cheek. Nolan stared at it good, and he remembered. He remembered everything. He remembered the riot. He remembered the screams, the blood, the beating of his own heart, but most importantly of all, he remembered Torres. Torres the orc, and how cauldron hot his cellmate shiv had felt as it slid across his face like butter. He remembered how much he had begged and pleaded, and how not only did his pleas completely fall on deaf orc ears, but also how utterly amused and delighted Torres the orc seemed to be by it all. Nolan stared at it good, and he remembered. He remembered that hadn't Nolan once felt sorry for him too? For some dirty, miserable, rotten little fiend? I want my face back, you son of a bitch. I want it back! Give it back! Nolan yelled, punching and smashing his bathroom mirror into 1,000 pieces. Give it back, Torres! Give it back! He screamed and he screamed as glass-shattered bits crashed down around his feet, making hundreds upon hundreds of beautiful, pinging, crackling noises as they hit the floor. As they hit the stone floor, making his entire wash basin sound as if for the briefest of moments, a very heavy winter hail had just fallen all around him. Nolan breathed in heavy, staring at the mess he had just created, and the empty stone wall where his wash basin mirror had just been. It was a really, really stupid thing to do, of course. Wash basin mirrors were not cheap for one, and his left hand was now bleeding profusely. But in all honesty, the pain was actually helping. The sting of fresh pain helped to soothe and calm down his many anxieties and worries right down, same as it always had for these past couple of years. For these past couple of years, pain had always been Nolan's little helper. Pain was his little pal to help get him through the everyday of dungeon work. Giving it, receiving it, whatever, it didn't matter. But even Nolan knew a day was coming where not even the pain would be able to help him out anymore. He only hoped to Fonda that that day was not today, not on Garland McMillan Day. But then suddenly Nolan felt something surprisingly warm, something surprisingly soft and fluffy rubbing and cuddling up and down against his ankles, only to soon shut its eyes and then fall back to sleep. "Swifty," Nolan screamed. "Get off!" Nolan went back upstairs to his filthy kitchen, leaving the filthy mess of shattered wash basin mirror behind him. He bandaged up his left hand as best as he could, and he changed into his turnkey uniform, his gray sergeant's turnkey uniform. Because Officer Nolan was not just some regular flat-bottom, round-bellied turnkey, no! At 27 years of age, he was nothing less than Ogre Dungeon's youngest and top sergeant. He was head of the IOD and Sharperton's right-hand elf, which was all a very, very nice way of saying that he was probably the last creature in Ogre Dungeon that you ever wanted to mess with, save Sharperton himself. And it's gonna stay that way too, Smitty, he added, finally loading up his broken stick. wooden sword onto his belt. Sergeant Nolan then stumbled out his front door and almost headfirst into a pile of dirt and grass clippings. The gravity outside his house had somehow felt 3 times stronger than it had been inside his cool, comfy house, and the sun itself seemed to burn so hot on him that it almost burned his skin. Nolan stumbled on down Steiner Street, where all his happy-faced neighbors went about their happy-faced morning routines. Some elves fed chickens and backyard pigs. Some collected milk from the milk elves. Others picked up their morning copy of the Herald from the local newsy boy. "Have a nice day, Nolan," dared a milk elf crossing Nolan's path. "Don't tell me what to do," Nolan retorted. To no surprise, really, Nolan honestly really did not like any of his neighbors at all. In fact, he pretty much hated them, but not for the usual turnkey reasons you might expect. He didn't hate them because none of them ever know what elves like me have to do down at Ogre Dungeon to keep them safe, or they should be more appreciative of turnkeys. They should throw us all a parade or something, blah blah blah. No, in all honesty, the truth was that he didn't like them because they scared the daylights out of him. Because you never knew what a smiling creature on the outside was gonna do. They were totally unpredictable, unlike most of the creatures locked up in Ogre Dungeon, of course. Nolan honestly didn't know how to deal with creatures smiling at him anymore. Only creatures that wanted to rip his fond-to-be-damned elf head off and put it on a stick. And yes, he totally knew how messed up that was. And sad. So no, he really didn't hate any of them deep down. But if there was one creature in all of Autumn that Nolan really and truly hated deep down above all others, if there was one creature in all of Autumn that Nolan had practically fantasized about beating the crap out of on a daily basis, that creature was none other than Constable Jeff! Nolan screamed, because lo and behold, there Jeff was, right in front of him, as if by magic. Second Lieutenant Constable Jeff.